So I want to say good morning to those of you who are here in person and also for those who are joining us on live stream. It's good to be here. Again, I'm Lorraine, and I'm going to be bringing the message this morning. So we started this series, and this series is called Crucial Conversations. And the reason that it's called that is because we're going to be looking at the conversations that Jesus had with his disciples literally hours before he was going to be arrested and then put to death. So it kind of begs the question, like if you knew you were terminal, if you knew you had only a few hours left on this earth, like who would you hang with? What would you say? What would you do, right? I don't know about you, but I would be with the people whom I love. I would be with my family. I would be with my friends. And it wouldn't be small talk. It wouldn't be like little insignificant chatter. It would be something that I would want to communicate to them that's like really important. So these conversations that Jesus had, it's the same thing. He's had 3 years of ministry with his disciples. And a lot of the things he did and said, they witnessed, but now his time is so limited. It's like he's saying, listen up, because I want you to pay attention. This is really important. And then he is wanting them to do that because he knows what it's going to take to live a life, a fully human life that's going to flourish as just people and as followers of Jesus. So this morning, we're going to be looking at, as Chelsea did such a wonderful job reading, a text that talks about betrayal. And we know the person who betrayed Jesus is Judas. But we're also going to be looking at how Jesus responded to that betrayal. And it's my feeling that Jesus responded in such a way as to invite Judas to make a different choice. That when he was responding to Judas, it was in a posture of forgiveness, because Jesus was, not that he was condoning the evil that Judas was about to do, but he was inviting Judas to make a different choice. So before we kind of get into the verses that were read, I want to give you a little bit of the context of how it even got to this place. Like, how did it even, Judas even land at having the desire or the idea to betray Jesus? So Jesus had a ministry. He had been in ministry for 3 years. He chose 12 disciples, Judas being one of them. They were with him for those 3 years. He did all sorts of wonderful things. Jesus, he would heal people. He would feed like the multitudes. He cast out demons. He did all sorts of good things. And by doing that, he had a lot of people who were following him. Like a lot of people, they loved Jesus. Now, some people, they followed him for different reasons. You know, maybe they just were hungry and they wanted to eat, or they were sick and they wanted him to heal them. But for the most part, everybody who was following Jesus, for whatever the reason, they loved him. But there was one group of people who didn't love him. In fact, they hated him. And that was the religious elite in Israel, the people that are the Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and the scribes, there was always tension with them and Jesus. And that kind of built up to a particular, like it crescendoed when Jesus did something absolutely over-the-top miraculous. Jesus had a friend whose name was Lazarus, and Lazarus had died. Jesus was in another town. He got word that Lazarus died, and it took him a couple of days. He gets there. Lazarus has been dead for days. His body is already decaying, and Jesus does something miraculous. He brings Lazarus back from the dead. Now, normally, you would say, wouldn't this be good news? This was good news for Lazarus. It was good news for his family. It was probably good news for anyone in that community. But the people who were not happy about that were the religious elite. And it's in that chapter 11 in the Gospel of John, that they say, you know what? Jesus, he's got to go. There's more people that are going to start following him. He's got to go. But they recognize Jesus has a lot of people that like him and are always following him. So they know, we can't really hatch this plan out in the open. We need to get to somebody who knows the ins and outs. We need to get to somebody who knows Jesus' comings and goings, somebody close, somebody like a disciple. And that particular disciple is Judas. So that leads us to where we were last week. Last week, we know that, again, we're at the tail end of Jesus' ministry and life here on earth. And last week, Pastor Vincent talked about Jesus having this festival with his disciples. It was the festival of Passover. So Jesus had secured a room, and that's where they were going to have this meal together. Now, there's some things that are obvious in certain cultures that are not always obvious in our culture. And one of those things is the fact that the people who lived in the first century, they were always wearing sandals. Like we have socks, we have shoes. But the people who were living in the first century, they were wearing sandals. The streets were not paved, they were dusty. So at this particular Passover meal, they all arrive, and they're all expecting that somebody is going to wash their feet, which seems kind of odd to us because it's not something that we customarily do. So when they all, and the person who would wash someone's feet would be a servant or a slave. So they arrive at this meal. They all are reclining at the table. And again, I want to point out what this would look like. The table was kind of a lower table. There would be cushions on the floor. People would not sit in a chair like we do. You would be sitting on this cushion. And you would sit sort of like, you would recline on your forearm and your left arm, and then you would be eating with your right hand. Most people were righty. And you would have your feet up. But again, you wouldn't have shoes on. That's why it was so important that people would wash their feet. Because if you're having a holiday meal and someone's dirty, dusty, smelly feet, it's not really conducive to having like a good meal. So as Pastor Vincent said last week, all the disciples are with Jesus. They're at the table, and they've recognized, like, who's doing this foot washing? And Jesus does the unimaginable. He gets up from the table. He gets a basin of water, a towel, and he starts to go around and wash all the disciples' feet. And I say all the disciples' feet. Judas was there too. Now, this was an awkward moment. This was an awkward moment for a number of reasons. It was awkward because, first of all, no respectable rabbi had ever done anything like this before. Like, it's the disciples that serve the rabbi, or the students that serve the teacher. This is like mind-blowing. And they would have been a bit embarrassed by this too. Embarrassed in that, I can't believe he's doing this, and embarrassed like, I guess we should be doing this. But because they were oftentimes arguing who's the greatest, greatness was not linked to being a servant or a slave that washed people's feet upon entering a holiday meal. So Jesus goes around and he washes everybody's feet, and some of them resist. We see that most clearly in Peter's response, no. And then Jesus says this, that I need to do this. You'll know why, but I need to do this because Jesus is giving them a living example of what it looks like to be like a human being that's going to be fully flourishing and as a follower of his. So after he finishes washing everyone's feet, he returns to the table and he says, I have given you an example to follow. if you do this, if you put this into action, serving others, loving others, you too are going to flourish into the kind of people that I want you to be, and you should want to be too, as a follower of mine. So that brings us to our text this morning, that Jesus gives them a living example to follow. And remember, we are hours away from Jesus being killed. Hours away. So all of these things, the things that Jesus says, the actions that he's doing are very intentional. So upon the scripture verse this morning, I'm just going to read the first few verses in this, because I don't know about you, but they're kind of confusing, and they're confusing. I'll explain. In verse 18, he says, I'm not saying these things to all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but this fulfills the scriptures that says, the one who eats my food has turned against me. What is he talking about, right? Like at first glance, it doesn't make any sense. What Jesus is doing, and I believe that Jesus is communicating to Judas in a lot of different ways. He's communicating not just to Judas, but he's communicating straightforwardly. He's communicating through, like, indirectly, and then he is communicating through his gestures. This particular line makes no real sense to us, because what Jesus is quoting is a quote from Psalm 41, verse 9. And let me read that to you. Even my best friend, the one I trusted completely, the one who shared my food, has turned against me. So Jesus is using this psalm as a hook. And he's saying this to Judas. Now, all of the disciples would have known what he was talking about. In our culture, generally, we do not quote psalm verses to one another. That doesn't make sense to us, right? It goes right over our head. But in their culture, they knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about King David, who was the most famous king in all of Israel, and he's talking about a situation that where King David was betrayed by a close friend. See, in our culture, when we want to make a point that's not so direct, lots of times what we do is we quote a movie verse, right? A line from a movie. And you kind of get the idea of what someone's trying to say. Like, for instance, can you guess what this is? Snap out of it, right? It's like, hey, straighten up. What was that line from? What movie? Moonstruck, right. Or, hello, McFly. Right. So, Back to the Future, exactly. And those two lines, we know exactly what that is. It's like, hey, snap out of it, or like, duh, you know. So when Jesus is using this particular psalm, he is saying to Judas, you are my close friend, my best friend. At this point in the evening, in this meal, the only two people that know about this plan, about Judas betraying Jesus, they're just two people, Jesus and Judas. They're the only ones. That's why I think Jesus is using this verse in the Psalms to say, hey, you are my close friend. You don't have to follow through with this. You don't have to do this. Then this chapter goes on to say that I'll tell you this beforehand so that when it happens, you will believe that I am the Messiah. I tell you the truth, anyone who welcomes my messenger is welcoming me. Now, Jesus was troubled. So we know that Jesus is not hiding how he feels. Again, I think this, communication is fairly sophisticated, because we communicate it on a lot of different levels, and that is going on absolutely at this meal. It's not as if Jesus is saying, hey, I'm just keeping a stiff upper lip. It's not like he's saying, oh, I'm just going to be stoic and not let anybody know how I feel. He's visibly troubled, and they know it. And they know it. And then he comes out and he just straightforwardly says, you know, one of you is going to betray me. This is shocking to them. Shocking. In fact, they have no idea who would do this. No idea who would do this. It's not as if Judas has been talking smack about Jesus behind his back, because if that was the case, they would all be like, oh, it's got to be Judas, right? But what do? They all think, is it me? Did I do something? Did I do something that has caused Jesus to think that I have betrayed him? Now, let's look. We know a little bit about Judas. We don't know a ton about Judas, but we know a little bit about Judas. We know that he's one of the 12 disciples. We know he's been with Jesus for 3 years, so he's had a front row seat. And we also know this about him. We know that he is someone who is like the treasurer of this group. He's been keeping the money. So anytime that money needs to be paid out to someone, because, listen, they lived in a world that you needed money as well. So whether you were buying food for this meal, whether you were securing the upper room, you know, money needed to be exchanged. Judas was that guy who was in charge of that. And whether you're in the 21st century or you're in the first century, the people who take charge of money are usually the people who are deemed the most trustworthy, right? You know, because we don't just hand over money and say like, oh, you know, you kind of have them vetted. So Judas is one of those people who no one expected was the one who was betraying Jesus. Again, they thought maybe it was them. So as they are around this table, there's silence. And then we have Peter, who kind of breaks that silence with motioning to John, like, hey, who is it? So again, I want to point out some things that might not be so obvious to us in the 21st century. Meals in the first century, there was significance in where someone sat. So the people who sat to the right and the left of the host were always sitting in a place of honor. So Jesus was the host of this meal, and we know that the person who was sitting to Jesus' right was John. And you say, well, how do you know that, Lorraine? Well, Peter, it's also worth noting, is not sitting in a place of honor, but he motions to John like, hey, ask him, who is it? We know it's to the right because he leans back on his breast and asks Jesus, who is it that's betraying you? Jesus responds to John's question, but again, Jesus is also communicating to Judas. Jesus says this, the one who I dipped the bread in and handed to, that's who it is who's betrayed me. And he hands that to the other person who I believe is in the place of honor, Judas. So we have John on Jesus' right, and we have Judas on his left. Now again, in this culture, that gesture, everyone else around that table would have interpreted it like this. When you would hand somebody like a piece of food, it was as if you were saying, you are my special friend. This is Jesus' last gesture of like saying to Judas, you don't have to go through with this. This plan that you are part of betraying me, as heartbreaking as it is, you don't have to do it. Judas takes that bread from Jesus, and it's at this point that Judas makes the worst decision of his life, where he decides to actually execute this plan. It's like Jesus was saying to Judas, I see you, I love you, you are my friend, my best friend. And Judas makes a bad choice. The text tells us that Judas, he gets up, and then Jesus says this to him, what you're going to do quickly. Now that would have been interpreted by everyone else around that table other than Jesus and John. Chances are Peter didn't know who the betrayer was, but we know that John knew and Jesus knew. That they would have interpreted that line that Judas was just going to the temple to give money to the temple because it was customary on the evening of Passover that you would give alms to the temple because people who were poor would come and collect that. So that line, again, it's not, Jesus never outs Judas to this group. And then we end with something that is a very ominous line. And it was night. Now, any time that we are making a decision where we're lying or cheating or betraying or doing something that's not going to be for our benefit or for the good of someone else, it always leads us into very dark places. And the text is telling us that. And I believe that Jesus, he gives us this living example. He gives us this living example of how to respond in the face of betrayal. And how he responded was with grace, and he responded with forgiveness. He calls us to follow him and live like him. You know, forgiveness is one of those things that is really hard, right? It's something that we're called to do, and it's a hard thing for us to do. And that's what I think that Jesus, it's not like he can change Judas's mind. He doesn't control Judas, but as he responds in this forgiving way, he's inviting Judas to make a different choice. So I think that in a group this large, when we talk about forgiveness, sometimes people might just tune out because you've listened to some sermons, or you've listened to people who've talked about forgiveness, and you've thought, well, Lorraine, you don't know my life, or somehow it's been cheapened. And I don't want you to tune out right now because that's not where I'm going with this. I would imagine that in this kind of a group, the size of a group, there's a number of people who have been betrayed, who have been hurt and harmed in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's been through a broken marriage, whether it's been through a broken friendship, whether it's been physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused. And I recognize that forgiving people who have done us harm is really, really hard to do. Right? It's really, really hard to do. So I don't want you to think that I'm up here cheapening this and not acknowledging how hard this is to do. So, like, I know for myself, forgiveness has been one of those things that's a real process. If you were to ask me 20 years ago about this topic of forgiveness, you know, I had been working on forgiveness. I had a fairly complicated relationship with my father, and I had spent years, as someone who's been in church for a long time and has a title of pastor in front of her name, you know, I had been working this process of forgiveness, and I had really forgiven him, and that was a good thing. And if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would say, you know, okay, as much as I could acknowledge forgiveness, the magnitude of it, I wouldn't have felt it the way I feel it today. Because let's face it, not all situations are the same, right? Like some people, it's like, okay, you have to forgive them, and it's weighty. But then there's some situations that they're really weighty, right? So I currently have a situation where there's a person who has done some serious damage to one of my children. And that is a lot harder to forgive. That is a lot harder to forgive. Like, you can harm me, and that's, I can deal with that. But you harmed my child, that's a lot harder. Now, on a good day, I recognize that I should forgive. That this is the thing that God is calling me to do, that Jesus is giving us a living example to do. And I think, okay, I want to do that. That's a good day. Those days are rare. A lot of times, I'm in my head, and I'm conjuring up plans to retaliate. How can I make this person pay? How can I make them pay for the hurt that they did to my child? Now, I know it's hard. It's hard to let go of that. So when you hear me preach on forgiveness and encourage you to forgive, I am not doing this from a place that I'm detached from. I'm in it, just like you're in it. And I don't know all your stories, just like you don't know mine, but we know enough that when someone has really wronged you or someone that you love, it's really, really hard to forgive. So I just don't want you to think that I don't get it, because I do. I also want to start by saying what forgiveness is not. Because sometimes we think that forgiveness is this one thing when it's not that thing. So forgiveness is not staying in an abusive relationship. Forgiveness is not staying quiet about someone abusing you. Because anytime something is being done to you that is not good for you, you need to get out of that situation. And if someone is pressuring you to stay quiet, that's not for your good or their good. So forgiveness is not staying in an abusive relationship or staying quiet about an abusive relationship. Forgiveness is not pretending that you weren't hurt. It's like, oh, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm okay. No. Like, I think that we need to acknowledge that, hey, there's been harm done, and I feel the way I feel because of what was done to me or to my loved one. Forgiveness is not condoning what a person does. I think sometimes we get, like, if I forgive this person, I'm giving them license, like, yeah, it was okay that they did it. And it's not that, not at all. Forgiveness is not abandoning your quest for justice. You know, there's a lot of things that are unjust in our world, right? There's racial injustice, there's gender injustice, there's economic injustice. When we forgive somebody, it's a choice that I'm making, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to give up doing something that would promote what would be good for all people. And forgiveness is not reconciliation. Like, sometimes people think they're one and the same thing. They're definitely not. Forgiveness is something that I do for me. It's my choice. It has nothing to do with anyone else. It is my choice. Reconciliation, that requires the party that offended and the party that was offended coming together and deciding to reconcile. Sometimes that's impossible to happen because the person doesn't admit that they've done anything wrong, or the person died. And sometimes when you forgive somebody, you can let that go, you can let that anger go, but that doesn't mean you would necessarily need to trust that person. Because let's face it, it's not like we detach our brain. If somebody has done something that has betrayed us, unless they show that they are worth reconciling with, why would you trust them? So forgiveness has nothing to do with reconciliation. Forgiveness is a choice that you make for yourself. Now, there's a guy, his name is Lewis Smedes. He's written a bunch of books on forgiveness. And this is how he defines forgiveness. He says, it's an intentional decision to let go of anger and resentment. When we forgive evil, we don't excuse it, we don't tolerate it, we look evil in the face and we call it what it is and let its horror shock us, and then we can move forward in the process of forgiving. When we hold on to unforgiveness, right? When we resist that, it harms us, right? Because it's about us. It's when we're holding on to anger, when we're holding on to resentment. Lewis Smedes says this too about forgiveness or unforgiveness. He said, when we're not willing to forgive someone, it's like handing someone, like drinking a bottle of poison and expecting the other person or them drinking the poison and then you dying. You know, it's just, forgiveness or unforgiveness is linked to our choice. It's for our benefit. And you say, well, okay, well, what are some of the benefits, Lorraine? Well, you know, when we decide to forgive, we are saying, I'm going to choose not to retaliate. I'm going to make some decisions. I'm going to let some stuff go, which means that anger has a chance to diminish. The effects of that are pretty phenomenal. That helps us physically, that helps us emotionally, that helps us relationally. It lowers our blood pressure. Our immune system gets boosted when we let go of anger and resentment. It actually helps our self-esteem. A lot of times when people have been harmed, you can take that harm and think, you know what, maybe I'm less than. Maybe I'm not that important. Maybe I'm not that valuable. But when you decide I'm gonna go forward with forgiveness, you kind of let that go. It's better for your self-esteem, and it's certainly better for like future relationships or the ones that you're in. So forgiveness is a choice. It's not a feeling. It's a decision that you're going to make where you're going to be intentional about, I'm not going to retaliate. I'm not going to harm this person. So how do you go about this? Like, okay, you're talking about forgiveness. What needs to happen? Well, I think you have to make the choice first. You have to identify, hey, I'm going to forgive this person, and you're going to make the decision, okay, I'm not going to retaliate against them. And sometimes, I'll speak for myself. The best I can do is do no harm. That's the best I can do on some days. I can do no harm. Another way that we can help in this process of forgiveness is to remind ourselves that people are not just like an accumulation of their mistakes and their failures. Another way to help us move forward in the process of forgiveness is to recognize that every human being has value because they bear the image of God. This is my go-to as well. Even when I can't see that image of God, it's been so marred, I know by faith that this person has value, and I will make decisions based on that. Then I also think, to help the whole process of forgiveness, just change your perspective. Sometimes if you just, okay, let me look at this from this perspective, maybe it will help. Maybe it will help. And then we can reflect on the times that someone has granted us forgiveness. Let's face it. All of us are on both ends of this, right? We need to be forgiven, and we need to just be on both ends where we need forgiveness and we need to forgive those. So none of us really escape that. So what if you're here and you're thinking, Lorraine, I don't know, you don't know my circumstances, I can't do it. I feel your pain. I get it. This is really hard. This is really hard. Jesus gives us, though, this living example of what to do to be people who can flourish as followers of his. Even if someone wasn't a follower of Jesus, when they learn and sort of apply these principles of forgiving others, it's for yourself. It's for yourself. Recognize that if you can't do it today, tomorrow's a new day. You know, you be open to like, okay, God, I couldn't do it today. Give me some help and strength that I would be more open to making this choice tomorrow. And what if you're here today and you're like, yeah, Lorraine, you're talking about forgiving someone, but what if I'm the person who needs to be forgiven? What does that look like? Well, first of all, I think if you've done something to hurt someone, or you've ruptured a relationship, or you've betrayed someone, or you've done something, you need to state what you did. And you need to state how it harmed the other person. Sometimes we have this idea that like, oh, I'm sorry, and the other person who you offended is supposed to be like, oh, okay. No. If you're serious about asking for someone's forgiveness, you have to say, this is what I did, and state the action. And I know it caused so much harm to you. And then you need to give that person space to decide how they're going to respond. Because it can't be forced. It can't be forced. And sometimes, especially in churches, when people have done things wrong, it's like, hey, well, you're a Christian, you're supposed to forgive me. No, actually, that's the choice of the person who's been offended. They get to choose how they're going to respond. Now, will it ultimately be for their good? Yes, that's what we've been talking about this morning, is that forgiveness is the choice that I make for my benefit. For my benefit. So this passage this morning we looked at Judas and his betrayal. But we're also looking at Jesus and his response to Judas's betrayal, because that's who we follow. We follow Jesus. We're not following Judas. We're following Jesus. And we've looked at what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't. Forgiveness is for our well-being. Forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness helps us physically, emotionally, spiritually. Forgiveness is when we say, I will not retaliate against someone who's done harm to me. Bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. We don't control those circumstances. What we control is how we respond to those circumstances. It is my hope for you, and it is my hope for me, as we continue on this path of learning how to trust God with the areas of our lives that have hurt us deeply, that we too are able to land in a place where we can forgive for our benefit. Because the benefits give us peace of mind. It provides the path of peace for the relationships in our lives. And overall, it brings forth the kingdom of God that we're called to be a part of and participate in. So it is my hope for you and my hope for myself that God can help us in our pursuit of forgiveness. Will you pray with me? Father, there's so much emotion that goes along with this whole idea and process of forgiving, because we have been hurt and harmed in so many ways. Help us be people who are open to the example that you have set before us. Help us to trust you in those areas of our lives that we have suffered so much heartache and so much pain and suffering. Help us to pursue peace for ourselves and peace for those who are in our lives. We thank you, Lord, that you love us. Even when we're not able to do this, you still love us. and that you are committed to helping us to become the people that you've called us to be, to flourish into the people that you've called us to be. We thank you, and we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. On your seat, you have a blessing for the brokenhearted. It's a poem by Jan Richardson, who I really like this particular poet. So I would encourage you to put this poem somewhere as a reminder when you're feeling like, you know what, I don't really want to do this forgiving thing. That forgiveness is really a decision that you make for yourself. Forgiveness is like, okay, you've recognized that there is some cage that you've been stuck in, and when you actually lean into forgiving, you realize that you're liberating yourself by doing that. So would you just be people of grace and peace? There is no, just if you're wondering, if you have any questions, you certainly can talk to me. The reason that there is no Q&A after is because there's 15 minutes between now and when we have youth group. But if you have any questions or anything that you would like to chat with me or pray about, I would be happy to do that. So you are dismissed to have some coffee and have some snacks in what was previously called Fellowship Hall.